So I don't like to be an alarmist, but I think that all of this has been pretty alarming. I'm Freya, and welcome to Deep Dive Podcast. So recently, I've read all of Project 2025. I've read every single executive order that has been signed by Trump, and I've read all of The Network State, which is a book that came out in 2022 by a tech billionaire named Balaji Srinivasan. I think that's how you pronounce his name. And I've written some articles on Substack about Project 2025, about the executive orders, and about the network state. But even though my articles have been very in-depth, I haven't been able to cover all of it. So I really wanted to start this podcast so I can go super in-depth in talking about these things. I wanted to begin with Project 2025 because there's just so much. I mean, I read 920 pages of it, right? And I think the most alarming thing about it is that them trying to enact all of it, right? Like, I knew that they were going to try to enact most of it. I was kind of in doubt, I guess. But every single executive order, well, 95% of them have been ripped out of Project 2025. So I think that gives it a lot more value to understanding it completely. So I think that some of the interesting things that they start with in Project 2025 are that there's a huge focus on the nuclear family and aiming to dismantle the administrative state, which they say that like the liberals have created this administrative state where everything is tackled by bureaucracy, right? And so a lot of it is about cutting regulations and cutting different state agencies, which we've seen they've been doing. And I think it's especially weird that it's Musk doing it because in Project 2025, right, there's no way Elon Musk could have been involved before they started working on Project 2025 and even before it was released, because Project 2025 discusses cutting all these subsidies for electric cars and trucks, right? And so there's no way that Elon was involved before that because he wouldn't have said, oh, let's cut these subsidies, because it's been planned for a while that Tesla would get involved in making some like state like military vehicles, right? As we've seen recently with the purchase of like, I don't remember, like 400 armored trucks, something like that. So there's no way that Elon was involved before this. So I'm really interested, like I wish I could be a fly on the wall and know when he officially got involved and when they started spinning it more towards like a tech US empire, which seems like some sort of cyberpunk dystopian nightmare. But yeah, so Project 2025 also discusses a lot of stuff about defending the nation against global threats. It's a huge theme throughout. They're like, oh, we need to defend the US from Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela. So it really goes after other nations. I thought one thing that was super alarming was that there's a lot of like repetitiveness around, oh, the military and military generals need to be ready. They need to be prepared. They need to be ready. And I'm like, ready for what, bro? Is that a threat? For real, is that a threat? Because like, I think they're ready enough. Like, I think they've been ready. I'm liking the more chill US where, like, it's not in any, like, super active wars. I mean, loads of proxy wars. And, like, there is, like, terrible stuff that the US is doing in the Middle East. But, like, do we need to declare war on another country again? Seriously? Like, please, can we stop that? Can we fix our own stuff? And it also says that Project 2025 has been in the works since 1979, which kind of makes sense because this whole alt-right conservative swing has been going on for quite a while now. Regarding healthcare, it talks a lot about healthcare reform. It says that the federal health budget is putting a lot of pressure on, I don't know, I guess like the congressional budget and like the United States like multi-trillion-dollar debt. It literally says that the deficit issue is a Medicare and Medicaid issue. So while they've only been kind of attacking Medicare and Medicaid thus far, I think we can expect to see more attacks on those coming relatively soon, especially because it looks like Elon's gotten kind of into the whole Medicare and Medicaid offices. So that's fun. It also says that the National Institute of Health is paying for research in aborted baby body parts, human-animal chimera experiments, which is like mixing cells and genes of humans and animals, which seems fake, not gonna lie, and research that could have been responsible for COVID-19. And I thought this was super interesting because like at certain parts in the document, it blames China for COVID and says that like researchers in Wuhan like intentionally created COVID. And then at other parts, it's like the US created COVID. Like US researchers created this to destroy us. And it's like, what? Like, can you at least pick a side? Like, I get whatever you say is going to be fake, right? But can they just pick something? Like, at least make a choice on who fabricated COVID, in your words, which is just false. And it says that the FDA should reverse approval for chemical abortion drugs. And that's terrible already, right? But one of the abortion drugs, it's also a like heart medication, right? So it's not like these medications are only used for abortion, which like abortion should be allowed. Like people should be allowed to do whatever they want with their own bodies. But they're literally like some of the only effective treatments for other health conditions. So that's pretty terrifying. A lot of people are going to be shooting themselves in the foot with that one. It also says that it wants to change research to focus on stuff that's like anti-choice, pro-life, anti-LGBT equity, research that's against subsidizing single motherhood and penalizing marriage, which is like they don't want to do any more research that uplifts like gay marriage. That's not research. That's not science, right? Like within the National Institute of Health, in science, you don't just go, oh, I want my research to focus on why this is bad. No, you just do research and you come to logical conclusions based on the science. Like, that's just not what science is. You can't just focus on trying to hurt certain groups using science when hundreds of years of research has shown, like, this is how people are. This is what makes people happy. Like, it makes no sense. I mean, it does make sense because they hate us. They also want to focus more on healthcare that's market-based instead of, like, subsidized, right? So they want to focus more on, like, private healthcare and cutting down, like, Medicare, Medicaid, and any funding that is given to people that reduces medical costs. The CDC should never say that kids should be masked or vaccinated and that there should be no promotion of abortion as medical care, which is ridiculous, right? Because first of all, it is medical care, and second of all, like, even in instances where pregnancy is wanted, people might have to get an abortion. So, I don't know, they're just complete misunderstandings of what medical care actually is. The same with trans issues, right? So it talks about cutting funding for hormones and cutting access to hormones. And this is the issue with conservatism, right? Because they're like, oh, we should have small government, get the government out of people's lives. But they're just increasing like the government presence and rules and regulations around everyone who's not a cis white Christian man that's above like 6 feet tall, right? But they're increasing it on every other group, right? It's not, they don't actually know the principles of it. I don't agree with the conservative principles, but they don't even know what they are. One of the reasons that it goes after the FDA in Project 2025 is that it wants to reverse the approval of the chemical abortion drug. Network State also goes after the FDA and says that we need to live in a post-FDA world. And I'm like, this is weird, right? Because you don't see every theme that comes up in Project 2025 in the Network State, right? But quite a few of them. Most of the things that are discussed in the Network State do come up in Project 2025, not the other way around. But I think that's really interesting because was this crossing of ideas intentional? The books came out in the same year, right? They both came out in 2022. So was this overlap in ideas intentional, or was it just coincidental? And then tech billionaires decided, oh yeah, let's get involved in that. We don't know, right? But it's very interesting. So it also wants to change the National Institute of Health to change research to focus on the negative effects of gender-affirming care, which is, again, like I said earlier, just not how research works. It wants to find the negative effects of puberty blockers, hormones and surgeries, and the likelihood of desistance if children are given counseling. So by desistance, it means the process of stopping or reducing criminal activity over time. So basically it's saying that kids who are given access to gender-affirming care are more likely to participate in crime or become criminals. It also wants to add work requirements to Medicaid. So that's great. Basically, it says that when somebody is able to do some work, people should be required to. And who knows what their rules around that are going to be exactly. Do I expect them to be like, oh, well, this person has a disability and they can't work? No, I don't. They're probably going to be like, oh, they can work from home. They can do an office job. Like just put insane work requirements on everyone that has access to Medicaid, with probably few exceptions is what I'm expecting. And it also wants to allow like families that do get Medicaid to use like those funds outside of regular health practitioners. People should be able to use Medicaid for holistic care. Like, I don't know, say somebody wants to use like herbalism, right? Or homeopathy. Like, it's saying that people should be able to use that for their Medicaid funds, which is ridiculous. People should be able to access the care that they want, but also just there's some validity in like some herbs can make you feel better, right? Say you have a sore throat, you can drink licorice tea, right? That soothes a sore throat, right? But somebody who has cancer shouldn't be a victim of like homeopathic remedies with like doctors that aren't doctors. They're not medical professionals. They haven't been to school. And they're preying on people. And I also think that's really interesting. I don't know if you've read this book. It's by Naomi Klein. She's my favorite. I'm her biggest fan. And it's called Doppelganger, right? And in this book, she writes about how the like conservative and alt-right Christian nationalists have entered this mirror world, right? Where like everything is the opposite of how it actually is. Naomi Klein writes about how Naomi Wolf, she went from this like feminist left-wing kind of icon, right, who was really like profound for her time, and she turned into this alt-right Steve Bannon wellness person. I thought that the ties between Project 2025 and the whole wellness cult were super interesting because there is a tie between this wellness stuff and conservatism. Like, look at the raw milk trend. Who drinks raw milk? Come on. It's disgusting. But there's all this like discourse around, oh, you need to drink raw milk because pasteurization is terrible. They're infecting you with whatever through pasteurization. Pasteurization is literally just heating it up to kill off any bacteria. And I think that ties into like trad wives also. Because you got these like conservative trad wives. So many of them are Mormon. Have you noticed this? Like on TikTok, like all these Mormon trad wives that are posting content on TikTok constantly. And they're like, oh, all these pesticides, right? And it's like, sure, pesticides bad, right? But then it goes deeper and deeper and deeper. So it like almost begins with like layers of things that are kind of true. Probably not great for you to be consuming tons of pesticides. Sure, we have seen some negative health effects, actually, in areas where like, say people are exposed to tons of pesticides or whatever random dangerous chemicals, right? But then it gets into fake stuff that's just not provable and completely fake news. So then you have these trad wives that are like, oh, all organic, I cook my own bread, fine. But then they're like, oh, you shouldn't drink this clean milk, you should only drink dirty milk. And then they're like, oh, I drink water from my pond. And of course, it's all these people who are super tied in to conservatism and Christian nationalism, right? So that's part of that mirror world that Naomi Klein is talking about. At some point, the lines are getting blurred, and it's sending all these people down this really dangerous pipeline where all these people are getting sick, right? Like, we've got a measles outbreak in Texas right now, and it's this place where, I don't remember the name of the county, but it's where, like 16% of the population isn't vaccinated. With the measles specifically, it's either 95 or 97% of the population that you need to be vaccinated against it to prevent an outbreak, right? So we've got this outbreak happening in this school right now, and all these kids in this random county in Texas are having this like terrible disease that should have been wiped out. We haven't had measles outbreaks in ages, right? But it's just because of this, well, not entirely because of it, but at least partially because of this like really conservative trad wife and like podcasters who are going on and on about how, oh, you shouldn't drink pasteurized milk, oh, you shouldn't get vaccines, right? And so I think people are like starting out with like kind of reasonable ideas. Organic food might be better for you, I don't know. Like, they'll start out with something simple like that. It gets sent down this dangerous pipeline of complete disinformation where it's hard for like the average person know when the disinformation starts and when it really stops. So also, there's a lot in Project 2025 that is about abortion that is happening in the executive orders and that they are trying to enact right now. Like the stuff about enforcing the Hyde Amendment, which it doesn't allow any NGOs or aid to be given to groups that allow or promote abortion as an option that people can take for family planning in like impoverished countries that the US supports, right? So a lot of that is happening. They also want to reverse pro-choice interpretations that have been like put into the Emergency Medical Treatment Act, which is basically like hospitals, they're required to give emergency medical treatment, right? Regardless of if somebody has insurance or not, they're required to treat you for life-saving care. They want to reverse any allowances that cover abortion under this. So say somebody is having a terrible miscarriage or ectopic pregnancy and they need to have an abortion to save their life, they want to reverse any interpretations that allow for abortion under this. And it also allows like Catholic hospitals to not allow any abortion care if they don't want to. They also want to end all investigations into cases where abortions were refused. So there were some like investigations that were going on to cases where women and people with uteruses died because they weren't given necessary access to abortions when they needed it. And they want to end all investigations into any of these cases. And that's absolutely horrifying because if somebody's denied life-saving care, that should definitely be investigated and the hospital should be punished and families should be given so much. And women should be protected. Women and people with uteruses should not worry about dying because they had a pregnancy, planned or unplanned, that they decided to terminate or keep, right? Because a lot of women decide to keep these pregnancies and then they can't and they pass away from it, right? Just because of negligent hospitals. So of course Project 2025 also discusses redefining sex and gender because it says that gender ideology is a woke concept, right? It talks about woke concepts and woke ideology a lot, and the network state talks about this too. So Project 2025 discusses redefining the terms sex and gender to make it so sex is the only term used in the government. So like whatever you're assigned at birth is what you're to be called. And we know this has already happened in the executive orders. I mean, we're seeing a lot of this happening already. And it's just if it all goes through or not. Because a lot of this is being blocked by judges and the courts, right? But that's the whole point in trying to pass a lot of these executive orders. The whole point is to make it so there's so many that it's hard to stop all of them. And I don't know if it's working or not because we haven't seen the outcome of these court cases, but we know a lot of them probably will be going to the Supreme Court, right? And it just depends how the Supreme Court rules. A lot of the judges were put in by the Trump administration. We don't know how the Supreme Court is going to rule. They are very conservative. So it's speculation. Assume they're going to be okay with a lot of the executive orders that he's tried to pass, even if they are unconstitutional, because I don't know that the Supreme Court does care about the Constitution based on what's been happening, but we'll have to see. Additionally, so practitioners who were fired from hospitals for not wearing masks or using vaccines during COVID, so they're supposed to be relicensed. That's an order that was given under Project 2025. And they don't want to enforce the COVID vaccine mandate on any hospitals that receive Medicare or Medicaid anymore. So previously, those hospitals were required to make sure that their practitioners got COVID vaccines. They're not going to enforce that anymore. If they pass an executive order or any legislation around this, which I expect they will, because a lot of Project 2025 they are trying to implement already. There's a lot of terrible stuff around healthcare that they're trying to implement, and it started already. Project 2025, I think one of the scariest things about it is that it's supposed to be a rapid action plan. Some people are saying it's a plan for the first 180 days. It doesn't say that in the document, but it is happening very fast. There's also a lot around foreign policy that's in Project 2025, right? So a lot of what it talks about is defeating the, and I quote, anti-American left at home and abroad, right? So it wants to tackle leftism in the United States and elsewhere. And you do see a lot of that throughout the document. One part of it talks about creating a coalition of nations against abortion. So that's to try to enforce some because of America's hegemonic position, which is just their position of power above other countries, using that to persuade other countries to pass really strict legislation around abortion. And it discusses how defeating the Chinese Communist Party is its biggest priority. It says that TikTok is Chinese espionage. And I think this is interesting, right? Because Trump paused the TikTok ban, but he's the one who started it in the first place. And it's clear that that was ripped right out of Project 2025. And it says that economic engagement should be ended with China. But I think with the network state, just considering that book, a potential contender for some of the stuff that is happening, it talks about wanting tech control over the United States, right? The network state, I don't remember if it discusses TikTok directly, but it does state that there's a lot of threats coming from different social media companies, basically, if they're not allowed to talk about free speech. The network state says that the US government is suppressing free speech by not allowing a lot of conservative fake news. Conservative posters should be allowed to post whatever they want, and that it's a violation of free speech for the Biden administration to require crackdowns on disinformation that have been happening. And so that's kind of where a lot of the stuff that's happening today is coming from, right? Because we've got executive orders coming out about free speech. It's in Project 2025, it's in the executive orders, and it's in the network state, right? And it's all about how they should be allowed to post disinformation on there, which is crazy to me. Should people be able to say what they want? Yeah, but people should be forced to say things that are true, right? If you have a viral post that hundreds of thousands of people are seeing, it shouldn't be something that's not true. That's ridiculous. That's not free speech. That's dangerous, because what people see, what goes viral, that does influence elections. And we're seeing a lot of that, right? And there was this recent study that came out. I saw it in the news 2 days ago, and then I read the study. But basically, the study found that extreme alt-right politicians specifically, they were more commonly victims of disinformation and fake news than left or liberal people, right? Or even just mild right-wingers. The extreme alt-right, they were way more likely to be victims of fake news and disinformation, right? So I think it's really important that we manage that, especially because the public commons is social media now. How do you make that a place where information is safely distributed? Especially because a lot of people don't trust media, And I get it, because there is some terrible things that mass media companies have done. And it's so, how do you manage that? Because you do need reliable, trustworthy sources. Like, you shouldn't just listen to your regular person on social media who can just post whatever they want, especially in the age of AI, where people are posting tons of fake stuff, fake videos, whatever, and it's hard to know what's real or not, especially for people who aren't very good at interpreting what's AI. So I think the whole fake news and disinformation aspect of this is really important and could be very dangerous, because we don't know what's going to be said or spread or what's going to happen with any of that. So to you, I never left, but actually it's been 20 minutes because I went and got a sweater because I was freezing and my dog was barking because she's insane. But so along with all the stuff about tech and TikTok in China, there's a lot of stuff in Project 2025, global governance organizations like the World Health Organization, right? And so the US has already left the World Health Organization at this point, and that was part of an executive order enacted by Trump. But Project 2025 attacks the World Health Organization, the United Nations, it attacks NATO, basically any government coalition that the US is a part of. Project 2025 is very vocally against. It also says specifically regarding NATO that allies to the US are supposed to take greater responsibility in their own defense, and that they should play their own part in their defense against China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and defense against Venezuela. It talks about Venezuela actually a lot, and I guess it's because of the conflict there, because they were trying to go to a more socialist model, and the US didn't want that close to their borders. That's my take on it. So it wants to transform NATO specifically so allies are capable of fielding conventional forces themselves, and it wants to do more to deter Russia, which is weird, because for a document that talks about deterring Russia, a lot of the writers sure do collude with Russia a lot, isn't it? But it wants members of NATO to rely on the US for nukes and missile power, basically. And it also wants NATO allies to increase their GDP stake in NATO's budget, because right now they're required to use 2% of their budget for NATO, and so it wants them to increase that above 2%. It also discusses developing a NATO Arctic strategy regarding the use of Arctic waters. So it talks a lot about economic freedom in the region. It talks about how basically, because the ice caps are melting, there's a huge economic opportunity for shipping in the Arctic waters. So that's great. And I think that ties into what's happening in Greenland a lot right now, because we've got the US, well, not the US, but Trump and his allies saying, oh, we need to buy Greenland. Let's just take over Greenland, right? And Project 2025 actually discusses Greenland specifically because it's in the Arctic. And so Project 2025 discusses strengthening economic ties with Greenland and putting more military bases on there when we already have a lot. But I think Trump's just taking that even further to be oh, why don't we just take Greenland, which is actually insane. And it also discusses the potential of Greenland as a tourist location because of the ice caps melting, because I guess it'll have more areas that are accessible for people to visit. I don't know. It's ridiculous. It's literally saying, oh, we're going to have more water. There's going to be a lot less ice caps, so let's capitalize on this. So Project 2025 also discusses expanding how U.S. allies share the burden of counterterrorism, because it says that the U.S. does too much for counterterrorism, which is true. The U.S. does do too much counterterrorism, but not in the way that they mean. So it's talking about U.S. allies participating more in counterterrorism efforts rather than the U.S. just scaling back on that a little bit, because our efforts have not been successful. We've just decimated countries and actually caused a lot more extremism and terrorism rather than fixing that problem. So it says that our allies should participate in that more, and also that it wants to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. So that's interesting because China's Belt and Road Initiative is basically like, so China's put a lot of money into developing like underdeveloped areas, especially in Africa, where it's like supporting the creations of like roads and highways. Really like helped China, just like geopolitically and strategically, right? Because they've gained a lot of allies in Africa of countries that have a lot of like precious resources like mining, minerals, whatever. And so it's been really beneficial for these countries, right? But they want to counter that initiative. And I don't think they're going to counter it by building their own, Belt and Road Initiative or whatever. I think that they're going to counter it by just trying to undermine that initiative and not actually like replacing the good that it's doing. Because it is doing a lot of good for underdeveloped countries. But they're not going to say that. I guess I'm going to be the one that says that. So Project 2025 also talks a lot about the Mexican cartels, as we've seen this in the executive orders, right? And it calls for a fully sovereign Mexico. And like, what do you mean? Mexico is a sovereign nation. Like, it's already fully sovereign. But it's saying that Mexico relies too much on the United States and that it needs to support itself, which it does. So that's kind of ridiculous. And it says that cartels are negatively harming the United States. And like, sure, cartels aren't great, but they're not doing a lot to the United States. It's just basically blaming the drug issue, not the fact that insane barriers to access for healthcare and mental health support disproportionately cause addiction, which is obvious to anyone who's ever read a book. It calls for fully sovereign Mexico and attacks the cartels, but I think the executive orders have clearly gone way farther than this, because the executive orders, they also are like, oh, there's a huge cartel problem, but then it also discusses Canada, and the executive orders state that Canada has a huge issue with Mexican cartels, which is ridiculous, right? They're separated by the giant body that is the United States. Like, Canada does not have an issue with Mexican cartels. It's insane. With Greenland, I understand, like, I think it's insane, but I know what they're getting at, but I don't understand the attacks on Canada unless it's also related to the whole, like, new Arctic strategy that they want to create. That's my only hypothesis there. I couldn't tell you anything further. I don't know why Trump is going after Canada so much, other than potentially more of the Arctic control that Project 2025 talks about seeking. Project 2025 talks about not only like going after Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, but also withdrawing from the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and terminating all financial contributions to the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. And then it discusses the World Trade Organization specifically, and it says that the U.S. should cease any participation in the World Trade Organization. And then it doesn't say that it wants to fatally wound the World Trade Organization, right? But it says, oh, if it happens to fatally wound the World Trade Organization, then it will create a new one that's only open to liberal democracies. So I think basically it's saying that it wants to create like an alternative to the World Trade Organization that's only open to U.S. allies. And of course that's going to be terrible for the rest of the world, because with the economic and like position of power that the U.S. is in, it's just going to make global poverty way worse, right? Because World Trade Organization, World Bank, IMF, they do a lot of good at ending like global poverty, one that's only open to liberal democracies. And like, that's basically saying it's only open to U.S. allies, and that's just going to be terrible for the rest of the world. Also in foreign policy, there's a lot of talks about foreign aid and how foreign aid isn't putting America first. It says America first a lot, right? And America first is this whole ancient, not literally ancient, but it's a very old idea that the U.S. should be more closed off to the rest of the world, more populist and nationalist, and more individualistic. And basically, in foreign aid, it's saying that countries need to be on their own journey to self-reliance, which is pretty ridiculous because in most cases, the U.S. played a massive role in making it so these countries weren't self-sufficient, because through colonialism and imperialism, the US just deeply set these countries back. There's this book, I don't know if I'm getting the title exactly correct, but it's how the US underdeveloped Africa. Basically, through like colonialism, slavery, right? Stealing people from their countries and stealing resources later on through colonialism, it's been impossible for these countries to actually like develop themselves to the place where like a lot of the rest of the world is, or like the global north is in the west. So saying they must be like self-reliant and fix their own stuff is ridiculous because it's not their fault. It's the fault of the US and a lot of Europe. And of course we're seeing this happening through the executive orders. Project 2025 talks about scaling back US aid, but not only through the executive orders. We're seeing it through the actions of Elon Musk, which are completely just out there. Because he's not a government official. He hasn't been elected by the people and he hasn't been voted in by Congress. So how is he being allowed to operate as he is? But he's just some like random billionaire who's been given free reign to the entire country. And he even leaked some of the information. I don't know if you saw, but it's been in the news today that basically Doge accidentally put sensitive information on their website, right? And so who knows who has this information now? And the intelligence community is just scrambling. I don't know what information has been leaked and to who. So it talks a lot about cuts to US aid and says that foreign aid is un-American, which is... it's un-American of them to say. It's also just straight up stupid because foreign aid is one of the main parts of like the American neoliberal agenda, right? Because like neoliberalism is about getting other countries involved in like free market economics to expand trade with them and then like expand like US influence on these countries. So to say it's un-American is actually the opposite of what like American policy and the American agenda has been about for a really long time. Project 2025 also discussed, instead of funding just a lot of aid organizations, only funding Christian aid organizations. And not just any Christian aid organizations, but specifically ones that are like anti-abortion. That's where you get more into that control regarding healthcare and like coalitions of trying to make sure that not only the US becomes anti-abortion as a country, but trying to get the rest of the world on that same track too. And that's especially through exploiting countries that have less power than the US and making it so they can't get access without policies that are extremely controlling to women. It also discusses ending climate policy fanaticism. So basically it's saying that all these policies around climate and climate change are fanatical and like radical ideas that the US should not be involved in anymore, and that the US shouldn't care about anything regarding the climate when it comes to US aid, which is crazy because obviously a huge reason that so much foreign aid is needed is because climate issues are destroying the global south. We're seeing so many floods, wildfires in the US and in the global south. A lot of the coffee crop was ruined last year because there was so much flooding. It's extremely disconnected from reality, right? And I guess that's what they want. And that's why they're spreading all this disinformation, because disconnect from reality and not knowing truth, that's how they're putting their agenda forward. Is their goal just money? 'Cause here's the thing. If we let all these issues with the climate keep going, there's not going to be a world for them to rule over. So what's the end game? It also talks about leaving the Paris Climate Agreement, which happened on like day one. And any like global climate agreements, it talks about just leaving those. So we know that's already happening. It also discusses dismantling DEI and DEIA within the USAID like apparatus is what it says. And we know that's happening as well. It also discusses focusing on holistic healthcare in foreign aid instead of like actual medical treatments, which is ridiculous. It's part of that whole wellness agenda that's like got this whole pipeline to conservatism that Naomi Klein talks about in Doppelganger, like I said before, right? I think it's super interesting to see this happening in real time and on a global scale, because who knows where it's going to go. It also talks about ending U.S. aid programs and all foreign aid programs in Yemen, Syria, and Afghanistan. And like obviously, I mean, if you know about Afghanistan, you know that a lot of the problems there right now with the Taliban are the fault of the US. And it's tied back to the Cold War, when the US and Russia used a lot of Afghanistan as like a proxy war. And then Syria, you've got a lot of that is the fault of the US too. The US like used that as a proxy war as well. But a lot of the issues in Syria now are also the fault of the US, and the same with Yemen. So it's a huge lack of accountability and trying to like repair damage that has been done. And I wonder about how that is going to affect the future of the United States. If it's just 4 years, I don't know, like it's probably reversible, but what if it goes on longer? Who knows how long we're going to feel the ripple effects of pulling out of foreign aid in all these countries that we, the US, have damaged, intentionally or not, I don't know, but it's going to be painful for sure, not only for those countries, but for the US itself. It also discusses considering cutting aid with countries that are allied to Iran, and it specifically mentions like Iraq, Lebanon, and Palestine. It's like, why don't we make the countries that already hate us for destabilizing them hate us even more? That's great for counterterrorism, isn't it? Seriously, what are they thinking? The path to counterterrorism isn't destroying these countries that we've already severely harmed even more. The path to counterterrorism is, trying to help repair them and trying to make up for what we've done and trying to counteract climate change. That's the fault of the US. So it also talks about challenging socialist ideas in foreign countries. I mean, there's so many places they could go with that. And then it specifically says that it wants to fund partnerships with the private sector and support civil society groups, including university centers and think tanks that advocate for pro-free market and democratic ideas. So basically it just wants to support more conservative think tanks and university centers and research, which is weird, right? Because like in the network state, it talks a lot about how, and in Project 2025, it talks a lot about how, these universities, they're filled with all these woke leftists and liberals, and they're terrible, right? So it kind of ties into how it wants to change like health research and health funding within the U.S. apparatus to focus on ideas that aren't actually like the logical conclusions of like these sciences and social sciences. It's anti-logic and it's anti-education and intellectualism. It's going to harm both left and right thinking a lot more, right? And I think most of the reasonable people that identify as conservative are already anti-Trump, right? Like you can actually like see a lot of them online and meet a lot of them online, and they're like, no, this is ridiculous, I don't agree with that. Like there's a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, I'm conservative and I've always been Republican, but I voted for Kamala because this isn't right, like this doesn't make any sense, And it's like, I don't agree with conservatives, but I like those people, because it's like, well, at least I can think. So I think a lot of those people have already converted to our side. But I think through understanding theory and science, we can convert any people who are remaining. And it's really weird. It says that the World Health Organization is corrupt, and it says that the World Health Organization suppresses human rights through relations with countries that don't help human rights. So it says that by interacting with like anti-human rights countries, the World Health Organization is suppressing human rights, which is, it doesn't make any sense. Some countries might not have good policies around human rights, but the World Health Organization is supposed to be there to step in to uplift human rights within those countries. It actually helps neoliberal democracies like the United States by promoting their interests. There's a lot of attacks on single moms throughout Project 2025, and I guess it's because single moms like defeat their whole agenda, because they say, you have to have a nuclear family to have a good world that's religious. A good world doesn't have to be religious, but it says that fatherlessness is the main cause of crime, poverty, mental illness, teen suicide, rejection of the church, which I guess the state should be involved in according to them, and high school dropouts, and also says that fatherlessness is like a main reason why all these kids are LGBT, and it says that child support should strengthen marriage as the norm. Another thing that I think is terrifying that I bet the tech billionaires are going to get involved in is Basically, it says that the child support payment infrastructure is poorly done and that it should be done through a centralized app, which I bet Elon or Zuckerberg will get involved in. And the app that it's centralized through should account for things like clothing that was bought, or like a random cash that was given, or like things like buying school supplies, and that should count towards child support, which will harm single moms even more. So I think that's that's going to be the scary part of it, because it's going to disenfranchise them even more, which makes sense because Project 2025, the conservatives, they hate single moms. Who hates single moms? And additionally, there's a lot, obviously, about attacks on the LGBT community and things regarding DI and DIA that have already happened, like deleting the term sexual orientation and gender identity. It says that saying America is systematically racist is bad, and that the woke left says that math itself is racist, which is ridiculous. And then it does more attacks on the centralized administrative state. It wants to eliminate every DEI ideological project, and we've seen that happen in the executive orders, right? Like, we've seen the elimination of diversity, equity, and inclusion from all government agencies. And they're even saying that the plane crashes that happen are because of DEI and DIA in the FAA. I don't know how they're getting away with it, to be honest. Because even somebody who voted for him should be able to see, like, oh, well, that's ridiculous. It wants to eliminate any, like, racial classifications, and it wants to eliminate discussions of racial equity and critical race theory within anything to do with the U.S. government. And it also talks about the Department of Education and how the Department of Education shouldn't support any, like, schools or give financial support to schools that promote critical race theory, gender ideology, as it says, or racial inequality. It also wants to eliminate disparate impact liability, and that investigates when certain demographics are more impacted by oppression or injustice. So it just wants to cease any investigation into demographics that are disproportionately affected. It also wants to restrict the application of the Bostock decision, which was a Supreme Court decision that it protects employees against discrimination based on their sexuality or gender identity. And I feel like we can expect to see that coming up in an executive order. I don't know if the Supreme Court would uphold that, though, because it is a Supreme Court decision that was made, right? But it is an idea that's brought up in Project 2025. It obviously continues to discuss holding social media companies accountable because of their discussions on free speech and not allowing conservative disinformation, and saying that this conservative disinformation should be protected under free speech, which it shouldn't be. And I think one of the especially ridiculous parts of all the free speech stuff is how obviously the Associated Press was just kicked out of the White House newsroom. And it's because the Associated Press said that they're still going to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of Mexico instead of the Gulf of America. And some people are saying, oh, well, if they won't play by the rules, then they shouldn't be allowed in the White House newsroom. And it's like, no. Saying that if you don't succumb to the presidential authority, you're going to be restricted from access as media is extremely dangerous, right? And we don't know if they're going to start putting these anti-woke TikTokers and influencers in the newsroom instead, right? Because Trump has floated that idea of promoting Republican news sources and influencers and expanding their influence in American media and political discussion, rather than news organizations and official media organizations, and instead promoting those who they're not held by ethical codes of conduct or anything. So who knows what's going to happen with that, but that is a danger to free speech, not disallowing disinformation. So there's a lot about taxes, obviously. It talks about reversing the Biden-era equity agenda in taxes. And it says that we need to reduce taxes on corporations. And it says we need to reduce taxes on, like, regular people, which, sure. But it says that we reduce taxes on corporations by raising the taxes on the people. So it's like, yeah, great, we'll reduce taxes for everyday people by raising them. It also says that, and I'm quoting this, the Treasury should support legislation instituting a 3/5 vote threshold in the U.S. House and Senate to raise income or corporate taxes to create a wall of protection for the new rate structure. So basically it's saying that it should implement a new tax rule that makes it so to change the taxation on corporations, 3/5 of the House and 3/5 of the Senate should have to vote in favor of that, right? So it's basically trying to create a wall where it's impossible to overturn these new corporate tax rules. So basically they're gonna cut taxes for corporations by raising them on us, which is great. It also discusses reviewing the IRS IT contracts, and I think we're gonna see that with Elon Musk and Doge. Project 2025 talks a lot about IT and the US Digital Service, and Doge is meant to be the replacement of the US Digital Service, and it's clearly destroying the country already. So we'll see what happens with that. It also discusses repealing the Corporate Transparency Act, cuts to the Federal Reserve. It discusses closing the disaster loan program and FEMA, so that's not great either. And it discusses expanding all tariffs on China, which we've seen happen. It also wants to cut all made in China products, and we can see that in the tariffs that have been discussed in Project 2025 and those that have been implemented, because Trump signed an executive order putting a 25% tariff on China. So it also discusses defining anything that represents the LGBT community as pornography, and then it goes on to say that pornography should be outlawed and banned, and that anyone who promotes it, including librarians or educators, they should all be punished to the fullest extent of the law for promoting this pornography. Project 2025 also mentions eliminating the morning after pill, and we are seeing legislation that would do this proposed. I think it was Oklahoma or Nebraska, one of those two though, where a bill was proposed to completely eliminate the morning after pill called Ella. I don't know what implementing those on a state basis would mean for the rest of the country, but clearly it's not good, and clearly steps are being made to actually completing that ban. It would have to be held up, but Roe versus Wade was overturned, so anything can happen. So in healthcare, it discusses keeping any pro-choice benefits out of healthcare benefits plans and jobs benefits plans. So basically it discusses how women can be provided birth control, morning after pills, abortion care under health insurance benefits programs that are tied to their job. And it says that this should be stopped. There's a lot about the climate, a lot of which I've covered already, especially as it relates to Greenland and the Arctic. But some additional stuff that it discusses are ending carbon capture utilizations and storage programs. And then it wants to end the focus on climate change and green subsidies throughout the EPA. There's a lot of cuts to the EPA that are discussed throughout. It discusses specifically a lot about the Forest Service wildfire management. It says that the Forest Service shouldn't be allowed to do controlled burns to prevent wildfires, and instead the Forest Service should promote the management of vegetation and reduce obstacles to reducing fuel buildup by increasing timber sales. So it basically is saying that instead of doing controlled burns, the Forest Service should increase timber sales and increase cutting down forests, and that will prevent forest fires. Because I guess if you don't have any trees, you can't have a forest fire. So maybe they're onto something, if we turned every national park into a parking ramp, some malls, there wouldn't be forest fires because there'd be no forest to burn down. Maybe we're the stupid ones. It also discusses eliminating energy efficiency standards for appliances. So this is just more regulation cuts, which, who wants higher energy bills? There should be energy efficiency standards on appliances to help the planet, but also it's just going to cost us more. Electricity and gas bills are just going to be more expensive with fewer regulations. It also wants to eliminate the Office of Clean Energy Distribution, and it wants to eliminating the Office of Clean Energy Distribution, which is terrible, but it ties into news about Elon has gone after, with Doge, he's gone after the Department of Energy, right? And Elon yesterday got Trump to fire a lot of officials who are working in the U.S. nuclear management program. And Trump has tried to take it back, I guess, now, and tried to rehire a lot of people who are working for the U.S. nuclear management program. But Project 2025 discusses expediting the reviews and approval for a lot of the licensure for nuclear reactors. So basically they want to increase the amount of nuclear reactors in the US, which is great if we got regulations, because I think we need more radiation leaks in the US. The water in the US is not dirty enough. We should only be able to drink Nestle, clearly. And then also, so currently there's this radiation exposure guideline, which says that radiation exposure must be, quote, as low as reasonably achievable. And it wants to completely eliminate that guideline to make it so it's no longer must be as low as reasonably achievable. Which, come on, who does that benefit? It benefits funding nuclear reactors and profiting off of it. But even they could have radioactive water. Who would want that for anyone? It also wants to speed up the review processes for new chemicals, which just isn't necessary. Do we need less regulation on potentially extremely harmful chemicals? No, we don't. It also says that there should be no new science activity within the EPA, and that there should be no conducting of ongoing or planned science activity within the first budget. It also discusses a prohibition on peer review activities within science. Who doesn't want things to be peer reviewed, right? And the answer is people who are promoting bunk science. Because if you release a study that's done completely incorrectly with completely false results and don't allow anyone to replicate it or do a peer review, then you can say whatever you want and you can pass whatever you want. It wants to cut the EPA size and scope. One thing that happened already in the executive orders is it talks about reinstating onshore oil leases, which happened. So it wants to consider the leases to the maximum intent. So basically make sure onshore oil leasing can go on for as long as the maximum lease allows. And then it wants to set the rents and royalty rates as low as possible. So literally they don't even want the government to benefit much off of onshore oil leasing. They're like, we're going to make this as easy and cheap for these oil companies and executives as possible. It discusses competitive leasing and development in the coastal plain of Alaska for oil and gas exploration and development, which already happened. That was in the first day of executive orders. Trump signed 60 executive orders in his first day, and a review of the coal leasing program, which also happened. It also talks a lot about BLM, but not Black Lives Matter, the Bureau of Land Management, so the boring one. It discusses rescinding Biden's executive orders that were about waste prevention in the Bureau of Land Management, and then the Endangered Species Act, reviewing a lot of the executive orders and just reviewing the Endangered Species Act as a whole. Sorry, I'm petting my dog if you're watching this video. She's stomping around unless I stay petting her, so that's what I've got to do. So Project 2025 discusses delisting the gray wolf, the grizzly bear, the sage grouse from the Endangered Species Act, because, I don't know, I guess the alt-right hates the gray wolf, Can't protect those anymore. And it wants to open more and more of Alaska to petroleum development. Additionally, they want to make the weather racist by breaking up the National Weather Service and the NOAA. And it says that private companies rely on the data for the National Weather Service, so it should fully commercialize, and that it doesn't utilize commercial partnerships as it should. Regarding federal workers, there's a lot in there about firing federal workers, and we've seen this happening, so I don't feel like I need to get into Project 2025 too much, but I want to tell you the theory that's established in 2025 behind it and why it's happening, all these firings of federal workers. And basically it says that federal employees are often ideologically aligned with each other, and that this is a threat to the conservative movement or the conservative promise. So it literally discusses how to fire bureaucrats. And it says that the worker that holds a position sets its policy. So the worker should be conservative aligned and aligned with the conservative promise, aka the Heritage Foundation, aka MAGA, aka the alt-right. So it discusses merit hiring instead of DEI, which is, it doesn't make sense, right? Because like hiring on merit is exactly what they're supposed to do, not just hiring like cis white dudes who are straight, right? Like hiring on merit is DEI because you're hiring everyone regardless of any like ascribed characteristics. They want to create way more comprehensive performance plans for employees. And then they want to rapidly introduce measures to act on low performance for employees. Basically, any employee that's been marked as low performance or is on like a personal improvement plan, they want to fire them as quickly as possible. They even discuss cash incentives for employees that are performing well. I don't know if that would disproportionately go to conservative employees, but I assume it probably would. And then it discussed having as many as possible employees ready on January 20th to employ. It also specifically mentioned the hiring freeze for all federal employees, which happened, right? A lot of this stuff has happened already. It hasn't completely gone through because a lot of it has been blocked by judges, but we're basically just waiting. So we're stuck in this limbo period where like a decent amount of Project 2025 has already been attempted, and we're just waiting to see if it's going to officially take effect or not. And we're just relying and waiting on the courts to decide. So who knows? So it also discusses, in terms of the military, the elimination of all DI, DIA from the military, and to stop looking at cases that involve discrimination based on race, gender, religion, age, pregnancy, disability, or national origin. So they're like, let's make the military racist again. MMRA, right? Instead of MAGA, MMRA, I don't know. So one thing that I thought was really funny is that it was like, oh, the withdrawal from Afghanistan was ridiculous. It was a terrible failure. I'm like, yeah, Trump did that, but you're the ones putting it back. And it discusses like reestablishing a culture of command accountability, non-politicization, and war fighting. So it's like we need to reestablish war fighting culture within the U.S. military. And it's like, okay, first of all, the U.S. military has always had a war fighting culture, as you can see by the sheer amount of wars that we have fought, especially if you include all the proxy wars. And then it says that the U.S. must remain ready and that military generals must remain ready at all times. They want like more expansion of the nuclear arsenal. They want to limit the nuclear energy office's size and scope, and we've seen that, right? With what Elon was doing yesterday. That is the limiting of the nuclear energy office's size and scope. And they want to expand the warheads produced by the United States. And they want to be more threatening to other countries by showing a willingness to conduct nuclear tests in a reaction to adversary nuclear development. So they're basically like, oh, if Iran keeps developing nuclear warheads, then we're gonna do more nuclear tests to show that we're ready for nuclear war if they keep developing. It's very aggressive. It's a very aggressive military strategy that's very threatening based on like the nuclear arsenal that the US has. It also discussed reinstating service members who were discharged for not getting the COVID vaccine, and this happened. It talks about Marxist ideology within the military like training academies and says that they need to eliminate all Marxist ideology within the military academies. And like, guys, the United States military is already the least Marxist thing to exist in the world. I'm sure there's no issue of Marxism in the freaking military academies or within the structure of the military itself. And of course, there's a lot of attacks on education and the Department of Education. It says that the structure of U.S. colleges and universities are tools of Chinese espionage. And it says that they should shutter the Department of Education and return education to the states, which is terrible, especially for people with disabilities, right? Because a lot of special education programs are funded by the Department of Education federally and not funded by the state. It says that parents should be able to use education funding to send kids to religious schools, charter schools, or private schools if they so choose, and that the funding for each kid should be increased to match that of DC. So in Washington, D.C., each kid is given like $22,000 in funding, and that's like per head, right? Like that's about how much goes to each student and funding each student's education. And it says that that should be the national minimum, and that if they make $22,000 the national minimum, then they should make it so parents can send their kids not just to public schools, but to private schools, charter schools, and religious institutions. So basically, like, use federal funding to support private schools and religious schools, which is ridiculous. No, funding should not go to that. They also talk a lot about FERPA. So FERPA allows children's full educational records to be seen by parents. And so they want to make sure that FERPA, like that through FERPA, parents are sure that schools are using the child's name at birth instead of any chosen names or new names. So they're only to be dead named. And then all pronouns will have to match those on the birth certificate, which is ridiculous. And it also goes after student loans and says that all student loans should be privatized. This includes Pell Grants, everything. They think that Parent Plus loans, they think that all education should be completely privatized and that the U.S. government should not fund it in any way at all. And it says that if the government were to still provide education loans, it should cut them as much as possible. It should make it so that universities have skin in the game, so that if people don't pay their loans back, universities are held accountable. So universities will have to hold students accountable for not paying back loans, which is really scary. Like, how would that be implemented? And that it should make it so the income exemption is at the poverty line. They also discuss IDEA regulation, or IDEA funding, which stands for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And they basically want to rescind equity in IDEA regulation. And it specifically states that they want the IDEA oversight and implementation to go to the HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services. So that's the one that RFK Jr., the anti-vaxxer alcoholic who put small animals in blenders, that they should be overseeing IDEA regulation. And that IDEA should allow funding to go to private schools and to education therapies for disabled students. So that's kind of scary, because it's like, so who's going to be seeing this funding, and where are these children? Like, what schools are these children going to be sent to? It'd be some really terrifying institutions. Places that aren't focused on, like, education or support for these children, but places that are harming them. It even discusses prohibiting accreditation agencies for higher education institutions from requiring that they have DEI or DIA programs in universities. So they really want to attack it across the board and through every avenue that's possible. They want to review all federal science programs, like within education. So I guess they're even going after the science fair. And they want to eliminate the Head Start program, which helps low-income families. They want to limit any federal subsidies of degrees, and they attack all educational unions. And they even attack all, like, federal unions, which we've seen in the executive orders and we've seen coming up recently. Project 2025 does state that they want to go after unions and union rules that allow people to work on anything related to labor unions while they're on the clock. And we've seen this start to be passed already. Trump did attack unions just earlier today, and that was in line with what was said in Project 2025 about not allowing unions to do any union-related work while they're on the clock. They even discuss repealing Davis-Bacon, which is a rule that made it so laborers and mechanics are required to be paid the local top wages for any of their work. So they're attacking education and unions and everything, just in every way possible, really. There's also a lot of attacks on food, agriculture, and the USDA. So they want to limit the U.S. Department of Agriculture, cut regulations in the food supply because they say that the regulations are harming farmers. But then along with saying that the regulations are harming farmers, they discuss. So they say that regulations are harming farmers financially, but then they say that they're going to reform and basically rescind farm subsidies and make it so they want to make it so farmers aren't paid for both revenue losses and price losses in the same year. So it's going to seriously negatively impact all farmers. They also want to reduce the price for the crop insurance to only 47%. So it's also going to impact farmers and the prices of food across the board if that does happen. They also want to repeal all export promotion programs. So basically they're like, oh yeah, we need to protect farmers in every way possible, but we're going to financially harm them as much as we can and make food as expensive as possible. And then within SNAP, like food stamps and government benefits like WIC, which helps like women and children and people with uteruses and babies who are below the poverty line or at the poverty line, they want to separate legislation from SNAP and nutrition, so food stamps and nutrition, and they want to reform SNAP by implementing more work requirements, which is similar to how they want to implement more work requirements in Medicaid. And because right now many states have work requirements for SNAP/food stamps, but they have them waived, they want to make it so states can no longer waive any of these requirements. They also want to reform the categorical eligibility for SNAP and TANF, which is another like low-income food program. And they want to make it so if you receive SNAP, you can't receive TANF anymore. So it's going to really terribly affect any like low-income people that are getting food benefits. They also want to reevaluate the baby formula regulations. So they want to make it so there's fewer regulations on the production of baby formula, and they say it's because there was a shortage during the Biden administration, right? But like, if we reduce the regulations on baby formula, who knows what they're going to be giving to the babies? It's terrible. They also want to reform the like free school lunch program, because I guess who wants to feed kids? Also, interestingly, which really aligns with the like recent attacks on the Associated Press in the White House newsroom, the Project 2025 states that the new administration should re-examine its relationship with the White House Correspondents Association, and it should consider an alternative body. And the White House Correspondents Association is who decides who can attend the press conferences of the president, right? So the White House Correspondents Association is an independent body that regulates who can be in the newsroom when a president is speaking. Project 2025 wants to change this and create its own body, and this obviously ties into the recent attacks on the Associated Press. I also think it's interesting because during the Obama administration, at one point they wanted to not allow a Fox News reporter in the newsroom. This caused a total outrage amongst the like White House press reporters at the time, and they were like, no, you have to allow Fox News, you cannot do this. And he was like, okay, but even though Trump's not allowing the Associated Press, where's that outrage from the reporters? I find it really strange. There's also a lot about the intelligence community within Project 2025, specifically the FBI. And I think this is really interesting because the FBI is the one who investigates like the January 6th terrorist attacks. The FBI is also the one who investigates a lot of disinformation coming from within the United States and outside of the United States. So they want a top to bottom overhaul of the FBI. And it goes on a lot of rants about how the FBI is attacking parents who are mad at school board meetings, and that the FBI shouldn't be the one policing speech, right? And so it attacks the FBI a lot. I mean, I think it's obvious why. It's what it says. It's because they're fighting against disinformation, and because they're the ones who regulate a lot of the federal crimes that the Republican Party has been complicit in, or at least adjacent to. It also discusses the Department of Justice and says that it should target career criminals, not parents, right? And this was in the executive orders. This was also in the bit about the FBI. Literally, it was verbatim in the executive orders as it was in Project 2025. But I think it's really interesting to say that you don't know anything about Project 2025, but then have quotes from Project 2025 in your executive orders. And the reason for this is because that was a lie. Like, he did know, obviously. I mean, he even said right before Project 2025 was released, he was like, oh, we're working on a great new document. You're gonna love it. And then he's like, I don't know anything about that. And I don't know how these people are getting away with lying. There's also a difference between like accidentally saying something incorrect versus intentionally spreading extremely false narratives constantly. I can forgive saying something that's like slightly incorrect every once in a while. Everyone does that. Like no human is going to escape that, right? But it's completely different than what's actually happening right now. It also says that regarding the Department of Justice, that they should start forcing line attorneys to take uncomfortable positions in civil cases because those positions are more closely aligned with the president's policy agenda. So I think that's kind of implying that, like, oh, any left or liberal, not the same thing, but any left or liberal line attorneys that are forced to take right-wing stances, they're going to want to quit, right? So they really want to whittle down any lines of defense that there are against these like right-wing policies and make it so everyone in the government structure and apparatus is extremely right-wing, alt-right, and conservative. So it's really hard to fight back against it, just because if they exhaust you with it, right, eventually you're just going to want to quit. Obviously, there's a ton of stuff around ICE, so Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and a lot of this has been starting already. So it says that they want to change any language that migrants may be detained to they shall be detained. So basically making it so anyone who is caught undocumented crossing the border will definitely be detained, or people who are living in cities that have been across the border for a long time or are undocumented, they're going to make sure that they are detained. And we've seen this happening with a lot of the ICE raids going on. I mean, they're even trying to go after schools and hospitals, which is horrific. I also want to say that immigration is not a criminal offense. Like, being undocumented is not a criminal offense. It's a civil offense. So basically, to try to make it a criminal offense is like trying to make not paying your taxes a criminal offense or having a parking ticket a criminal offense. If all these right-wingers want every civil offense to be a criminal offense, they're going to be in jail for a freaking parking ticket or a speeding ticket. So what's the deal? They want to implement the death penalty in drug trafficking. I haven't seen this coming up yet. I've heard some rumblings about it, but I can't confirm that personally that I've read that. They do want to use the National Guard and any active duty military in securing the border. And they want to like cut a lot of visa opportunities for any non-Americans, basically, especially from like hostile or enemy nations. They specifically want to get rid of any visas for any Chinese students or Chinese researchers. So that would terribly affect the US like research and education institutions as a whole. They also want to end chain migration, which allows you to, like, if you become a US citizen, you can bring your spouse, you can bring family, you can sponsor them. They want to completely end that program. So you can no longer sponsor people through chain migration. And they want to put more limitations on who's given work authorizations. Even the executive orders that discuss the FAA, they were also discussed in Project 2025. Like, I cannot emphasize enough. Most of the executive orders have been pulled from Project 2025, and they really closely align with the network state. So even the one that discusses eliminating DEI and DEIA within the FAA, that was in Project 2025. And the blaming of the crash that happened, when Trump blamed that crash on DEI, it was outlined in Project 2025. They said that all the dangers in American flights are because of DEI. And so that's where Trump got that from. And some of this stuff is just really scary. Like they say that they want to, in the VA, even say that they want to start automating disability claims through AI, which is terrifying. Who wants ChatGPT to be like, nah, you're not disabled. You can go back to work. No benefits for you. This is like VHA facilities being required to increase the number of patients that they see each day to match standard national minimum. So basically right now, practitioners on average in the VA see 6 patients per day, and it wants them to start seeing like 13 a day, which is closer to the national minimum, but that it doesn't meet the required care through being like, oh, you're not seeing enough patients when it's overburdened already. There's not enough people employed through the VA. So by saying, oh, they're not seeing enough people, it's going to be easier for them to later push for privatization of the VA and reductions of these services. You know, they pretend they care about veterans, but really they just want more war fighting and more readiness of military officials, but they don't want to help people who have been extremely harmed by participating in their wars. One thing that I thought was really scary was how it discussed how they want to have the First Lady take on hot button social issues to specifically deflect any negative looks that this has on the president. So I think we have to watch Melania a lot during this presidency to see what she's doing, because that will be used to deflect any backlash on Trump. So Project 2025 and the executive orders are absolutely crazy, right? Like, they intersect a lot, and it's clear that Project 2025 has been the blueprint for all of the executive orders that Trump has signed and a lot of the legislation that has been happening, and the Department of Government Efficiency ran by Elon Musk. Doge wasn't specifically discussed in Project 2025, but redoing the United States digital service, expansions into cryptocurrency, and expansions into AI were. But I want to talk some more about the network state and how that book by Balaji has intersected with all of this, right? I've touched a bit on how the network state also discusses things like going after the FDA, how it discusses anti-woke ideology, the whole weird free speech thing on social media where they're saying that disinformation should be protected as free speech. Let's put my glasses back on because my eyes be hurting. There's a lot in the network state that I think is super interesting and just weird and concerning. So basically the whole idea of the network state is to use digital influence and support that social media companies and like tech billionaires, they can generate all of this support through online discourse. Talk about using Discord servers and Reddit communities to generate a lot of support and to generate influence, right? And then they talk about how they can use this influence to either crowdfund land or to gain influence over certain lands. And it literally states that the best way to start a new country is to either crowdsource land to create and implement your own rules to gain diplomatic recognition in the future, or to rewrite a state's existing rules, right? And so I thought that was super weird because when we look at the influence that Elon Musk is having right now, it's clear that they are trying to rewrite America's rules right now. It says that it's focused on cloud first, so like online first, establishing recognition, and land last. But I guess it's kind of obvious that they're doing this just at the same time. And it's weird because the book attacks diversity, equity, and inclusion the same amount as Project 2025 does. Throughout the whole book, they're like, oh, DEI is useless because why are all these big media companies telling tech companies how they should hire people? And the network state attacks DEI and DIA a lot, and it also attacks media companies quite a lot, specifically the New York Times, saying that they hire using nepotism and that it spreads fake news and misinformation, and that the New York Times is a corrupt media institution. It says if all media is this corrupt, then imagine how fake history is. But it only attacks the New York Times. And sure, is the New York Times great? No. Personally, I like independent media organizations, but it only attacks one media organization and then says that all media is bad because of it. It also says that history needs to be solidified in the blockchain. So basically it's saying that because you can certify records and transactions on the blockchain, which is true, you should be able to certify historical events on the blockchain, which is kind of ridiculous because say somebody needed to input a record of a historical event on the blockchain. It would be up to the bias of the person that put it on the blockchain. So they're saying that it's some like immutable way to prove what's happened and what hasn't, but it completely ignores the bias of whoever is doing it. And it's saying that, oh, they need a good tech leader to lead this new country, this new network state that they want to form. And I assume that person would be the one to certify events happening or not via the blockchain. It attacks the left wing and liberals throughout. It's weird because it misconstrues a lot about politics and then uses that as a justification. It says that the left is not valid because the left was like, oh, we need to defund the police. And then the left was like, oh, let's fund the Capitol Police, right? But it's completely conflating like leftism and liberalism, which are completely different political ideologies. Leftists have discussed defunding police and focusing on like social support methods instead, right? But not liberals, not their Democratic Party. So it just makes completely false connections in order to convince you that leftism is bad. It's fake, right? But if you actually like dig into its arguments, you can see where it's not arguing anything that's sound. It says that like information is being distorted and that there's a lot of channel distortion that's been going on and that's been used to negatively influence the American people. And then in a similar way to Project 2025, attacking educated groups for being more left-leaning or more liberal, it attacks professors, educators, reporters, and says that the majority of them are liberals, so they must be corrupt because of this, which completely just ignores the fact that, oh, well, maybe people who are more educated are more likely to be on the left, so maybe there's a reason for that. And it says that the only reason you're hearing about strange historical incidents or media events or events like natural disasters is because of social media, right? It says that regular media isn't reporting on important stuff and that social media is the only way people are hearing about anything. Then it goes on to say that the left are there to delegitimize the current existing order by saying that the current existing order is unjust and that they're trying to redistribute any resources, power, money, or status. And then it also spreads COVID propaganda. It says that the left at first didn't believe in COVID and then they did believe in COVID and that's why they're not valid. And it's like, no, like maybe some people on the left or some people who are liberal or in the Democratic Party didn't see the issues with COVID at first before it was like a huge international issue. But if they later did, that's a good thing. It's good to change your opinions on things. If I look at an issue at first, I might be like, oh, what's the big deal? And then later on, as I gain access to new information, my opinion will change. And that's because I'm a person and people's opinions are supposed to change as they gain access to new information. Like that shouldn't be a punishment. That should be celebrated. This book gets really crazy. It attacks the left throughout, right? And says that the left and liberals, it conflates the left and liberals, but I'm going to separate them. But it says that the left and liberals are woke missionaries who control the narrative of everything. And then it says that the right and the tech billionaires trying to start their own state, unless it's a robot war, you need high morale fighters, so you obviously would need the right component. Literally meaning like the right wing component. So it's saying that they need the right wing to be on their side so they can be their fighters for developing this network state. But then it says, even though it spends the whole book just roasting liberals and the left wing, it says that, oh, well, we actually need the left and the liberals to join us because you can't have the mercenaries. It calls the right mercenaries. It says you can't have mercenaries without missionaries. Just really terrifying because I don't want a book by a tech billionaire who's trying to start a new country to establish who they need as mercenaries, private military fighters, their own military fighters. I don't want it to discuss that and to discuss how it's going to co-opt the left. And I think that's where a lot of the disinformation networks come in as well, is because if the left and people who are liberal are more likely to like find information online and listen to information that they find online, if they can change the narratives of things, and if they can convert people from the left to like the center and later to the right through spreading disinformation on networks that used to be trustable, like the Washington Post, for example, used to be a great source of news, then Jeff Bezos bought it. So if they can control narratives, then they can get people from the left wing or from the liberal side onto their side just through disinformation networks. And that's terrifying because they're literally calling us their missionaries. The network state also, I said it before, but I want to repeat it. It talks a lot about the FDA and how terrible the FDA is and how it should be your body, your choice, which it's not talking about abortion. It's just talking about the Food and Drug Administration and how you should have less regulations around food and drugs. I don't know. I don't like putting strange food or drugs into my body. I actually like those things regulated. I think regulation's a good thing because I don't like having severe health issues coming from the food that I'm eating. I don't know about you. And then it says that America might be heading towards its second civil war, which is a great thing to hear from somebody with that much power and control. And it says that there are going to be two factions. The first one will be the woke left, who will say that they're fighting for the U.S. establishment media, the New York Times, the federal government, wokeness, the dollar, and the Democratic Party. And the book says that the woke left, who are the first faction fighting the Civil War, are going to say that they're fighting for democracy and against insurrectionists. And then it says that the second faction of the Civil War will align with state governments, decentralized media, Bitcoin maximalism, the Republican Party, and they'll say that they're fighting for freedom against fiat tyranny. And then it says that it will be a war for minds and not for lands, right? And this is scary because so I've got a master's in peace studies, right? And there's this concept in peace studies called new wars. And basically it's the idea that wars are no longer traditionally fought. They used to be fought with really rigid boundaries with actors who you knew who they were and they were political actors. And now they're fought with more disinformation. You've got things like drones, you have proxy wars, you have multiple actors, some are state, some are non-state. This book is an exact description of how tech billionaires could start a new war to create a new tech state, a new network state, and they know how to do it. And it's clear that I don't know if Elon knows that he's enacting some of this. I can't establish that he definitely has a connection with it, but I can establish that he's definitely doing some of it, intentionally or not, and that is terrifying. The network state even attacks the UN. There's so many commonalities with the network state and with Project 2025 that it's it could be coincidence, it could not be, but either way it's really weird and really concerning. And then it says that you need a physical territory to have a region that's free of the FDA, the NRC, and to create a keto kosher community. Because for some reason, Balaji is obsessed with the r/keto subreddit. He literally talks about r/keto throughout. He even uses it as an example of how it would be easy to form a new state based on an online community, because he's saying, oh, well, if you can create an online community on Reddit that has moderators and people who follow rules, then you could definitely create a new online state and then use that to gain actual land and diplomatic recognition. And it's you're not supposed to actually conflate a Reddit community with a genuine state. That's scary because whoever controls the online community, they have so much power. It also talks a lot about Web3, and Web3 is really weird. So Web3 is really similar to the deep web, and it's really similar to Bitcoin, where it's completely decentralized and anonymous, so anything that anyone says can't be traced back to them. So the whole idea is to build this network state community using Web3, where people can have completely anonymized online identities so they can get away with saying whatever they want without any repercussions. And that means they could also produce whatever they want without any repercussions. So say somebody was making horrible deep fakes, for example, They could keep making those and spreading them, and they wouldn't face repercussions because their online identity that would be part of this new state wouldn't be tracked to their real life identity. And then where the book actually directly ties in to what's happening right now, other than some of the policy ideas, is it talks about how remote work, and Starlink, which is Elon's company that aims to give a bunch of people internet and digital access, it says that remote and Starlink open up the map to make this possible. So I think that's where it really ties together. Because we can't prove that Elon has a role in the network state, but he is mentioned in it. So I think that's interesting. I also think that online personality, TikTokers and tradwives and podcasters, they have a huge role in this that's kind of going unmentioned. Because you have people like Nara Smith, right, who are gaining immense popularity in the online world and the TikTok world, right? And what she's doing is she's promoting ideas that women should be home, women should be in the kitchen, women should be cooking constantly and making food completely from scratch. And she's a very Mormon person. She's extremely tied into the Mormon church. And then what's crazy is one of the methods that the Trump campaign used to promote his second term was uplifting anti-woke online personalities. That's what they said. They're gonna promote anti-woke influencers. And so all throughout the internet, you had all of these posts going viral from these MAGA people on Twitter and all of these platforms, right? And then you have this alt-right conservative tradwife discourse where you have people like Nara Smith who are promoting these ideals, these very conservative rooted ideals, through whatever content they're producing. And the crazy thing is, you have people like Nara Smith doing this, but they're the freaking breadwinners of their houses. They're the ones that are pulling in all the money, so they're doing all the financial work, and they're also doing all of the housekeeping, all of the cooking, all of the cleaning, or at least that's the image that they're spreading. And they're saying that by making this content, they're saying that you should be doing that too. And then you have other personalities, right now there's the Justin Baldoni, Blake Lively stuff going on, right? And so Candace Owens, for example, is making tons of videos on Justin Baldoni, Blake Lively, but she's an alt-right conservative MAGA supporter, and people don't know this, but she's gaining a lot of traction through making videos explaining what's happening with this It Ends With Us lawsuit. But she's a conspiracy theorist. She was promoting conspiracies about COVID. She's anti-Black Lives Matter. She promoted conspiracies that Biden actually lost the 2020 election, and that the election was fakely won, and that there was tons of election interference. And so you even have people who are making videos or content that is not related to alt-right ideas, but then they slowly spiral into conspiracy theories and the alt-right, and before you know it, that's the content you're consuming. So you have to be very careful about the people that we follow, because you don't know who could be trying to spread disinformation or who does spread disinformation, because a lot of people, they don't know who Candace Owens is. They're just following her videos about this lawsuit, and they're gonna eventually find that she's an alt-right MAGA conspiracy theorist. And then I also think that the alt-right podcaster pipeline is super interesting in this too, because you have people like Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan, I don't know if he used to be a leftist, but he used to be on the left. He used to be a Bernie Sanders supporter. But now he's super MAGA. He supports Trump. He supports Elon Musk. Didn't he recently have, wasn't it Elon or Mark Zuckerberg on his podcast? And Joe Rogan is actually really similar to Candace Owens in terms of the disinformation and alt-right swing and the alt-right pipeline. Because Candace Owens in 2016 or 2017, something like that, she used to be on the left, but then she said that she got awoken to the realization that the Democratic Party is evil and that leftism is terrible. And so Joe Rogan, he used to have Bernie Sanders on his podcast. He was a Bernie supporter. He used to listen to all of these professors and have professors on his shows and experts in the fields that he was talking about. And then during COVID, he started spreading disinformation about how the lockdowns were bad, how COVID wasn't that serious. And then he really started to take this sort of toxic masculinity turn that we're seeing now, Joe Rogan, during COVID, he started to host all these anti-vaxxers on his podcast, and he promoted the idea that horse medication, ivermectin, that was a good treatment for COVID, and that it was just like a cold, which is not true. And that's when he started to platform more conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones, huge conspiracy theorist, Jordan Peterson, huge conspiracy theorist, Ben Shapiro, right? Massive conspiracy theorist. And that's when he started really to criticize woke culture. And that's when he became anti-DEI, DEIA. He was like, I don't care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. When people are being excluded based on ascribed characteristics, that's not merit. That's why DEI exists. He also became super vocally anti-trans rights, especially about trans people in sports. And then in 2024, that's when Joe Rogan started to become a huge Trump supporter. That's when he became super vocally MAGA and then had a Trump interview. And I think through people who are on the left following these podcasts at first, or content creators at first, who are initially on the left, and then they slowly start to turn towards more right-wing conservative ideas, that's when it gets super dangerous, when people start spreading misinformation. And that's why we have to really carefully regulate what information is spread, and we have to regulate all of these scientific studies and whatever information and discourse is put out, is because it can be used in a super dangerous way to just spread lies. Then you also have people like Andrew Tate, and they just promote extreme toxic masculinity along with these conservative ideas and eventually conspiracy theories. I do think that the real way to tackle these issues is through tackling disinformation and conspiracy theories and from preventing that information from being spread or being allowed. So that's definitely why Project 2025, these executive orders, the network state, and Agenda 47, all of it. That's why all of it is going after how social media companies have been required to target disinformation that's been spread, right? Because Biden implemented those policies that said social media companies have to regulate disinformation. And by repealing those, the conservatives and the alt-right, and especially young men, are supporting these people like Andrew Tate and Joe Rogan. And then you have young women who are influenced by people like Candace Owens and Nara Smith and other trad wives online. And it's through this disinformation that either comes from the health and wellness alt-right pipeline or the leftist Bernie supporting to conspiracy theories to alt-right conservative pipeline. And that's where these people are joining the conservative movement through disinformation that's being spread. And it's not helped by the fact that there are tons of bots that are online on platforms like Twitter and Facebook that are promoting right-wing ideologies. And then you've got algorithms that favor right-wing posts and right-wing voices on these platforms. And so getting most of your news through social media platforms is a huge issue also. So I think what we really need here is more reliable media sources, right? And I guess content creators that we can trust. I mean, do we need more leftist white men podcasts? Like, literally? I don't know if I should say that the world needs more podcasters, but maybe the world needs more podcasters. But we need more people that are actually trustable, who will actually fight against disinformation. And we need respectable avenues to receive information that we know is correct, right? And by changing the way that research operates within the National Institute of Health, that's just going to create more disinformation because they're going to change the types of studies that they do and their research outputs. It literally says they want to change their research outputs in Project 2025 to focus on how abortions can cause breast cancer. I'm not kidding, it literally says that. So I think we just need more reliable information sources, and we need to constantly fact check ourselves. I'm constantly fact checking everything that I say. I'm trying to not spread any disinformation. And if I do say something incorrect, I do correct myself, right? Because there's nothing wrong with that. I don't care about being wrong sometimes. Everyone is wrong sometimes. That's just normal. But I think we have to get comfortable with that fact as a society, that it's okay to be wrong sometimes. Whatever, it's normal. We have to begin spreading accurate information and only trusting reliable sources. And we have to do whatever we can to stop this misinformation and to stop the alt-right pipeline that's currently happening. And I think people should do whatever they can to fight against the current administration that they can. Like, go to protests, call your representatives. You can use this app called 5Calls, and it will link you to your representatives directly to call them. It makes it super easy. You just have to say something simple. You can say, "Hi, my name is blah, blah, blah. I'm super disappointed that you haven't said anything about Elon's current role in the US government. He has not been appointed. He is not a government official. I want you to help get him out of office, or I'm not going to vote for you next term." You can say something like that. You don't have to be advanced with it at all. Every call helps, and they take calls really seriously. Calls count way more than like emails or social media posts. They're still helpful, but calls do a lot. You can even find scripts online for what to say to representatives. And we have to build community with each other too, and organize with people. Go to local businesses, go to things like community centers, work on a community garden with people, interact with people that you don't know. And that's a great way to build community. And I think that's honestly going to be one of our only options. We just have to focus on truth, calling representatives, protesting peacefully, and working to build as much community as we can so we can stop the division amongst people. Yeah, well, I guess this has been kind of a long first episode, but thank you so much for listening. My name's Freya Zank. This is DeepDive Podcast. The main theme music composition was done by Nick Stanger. Thank you so much, and I am on Substack at Fairy Crank, or you can just type in my name, Freya Zank, Instagram, YouTube, Deep Dive Podcast, Spotify, Apple Music, everything. You can find me everywhere. Thanks for listening.